So this is actually at least your second book, and really the sort of like the second book, and where you've had to weigh in on the question of anti-vaxxers or anti-vax or vaccine hesitancy, and I'm struck by the fact that like very different eras. Books that were written like 6 years apart, but very different eras within this movement. Tell us the context of your first book and how that came about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things I do, I like to write about a little bit about the geopolitics of infectious diseases, in addition to being a vaccine scientist. And the way I got involved with going up against the anti-vaccine movement and dealing with people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., et cetera, was I have 4 adult kids, including Rachel, who has autism and intellectual disabilities. And the first book I wrote, which was called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, to counter the original assertion against vaccines that started in the early 2000s with false claims that vaccines cause autism, and that made me public enemy #1 with anti-vaccine groups, or public enemy #1 or 2, but it also gave me a front row seat to watch how it evolved, and put me up against an interesting cast of characters, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The change was that it continued to accelerate. A lot of these anti-vaccine groups started monetizing the internet. They were selling phony autism cures and nutritional supplements. And if you go to Amazon.com and type in the words vaccination in the book section, all you get is anti-vaccine conspiracy books. So it became first a multi-million, maybe multi-hundreds of $1 industry. And then I think for me, the big game changer was about, even before the pandemic, it started to be adopted by the political right, which at one level made absolutely no sense, but at another level it did. It around this concept of health freedom, medical freedom. Hey, you can't tell us what we want to do with our kids. And it began in California, but it really scaled up where I am in Texas, and it got adopted actually by the Republican Tea Party in Texas, and started getting PAC money, Political Action Committee money, funding anti-vaccine groups. In fact, a big anti-vaccine group formed their own political action committee, PAC, supporting candidates to run on anti-vaccine platforms. And that's when you started to see it become enmeshed in Republican Party politics. It also got to be harder and harder for me to talk about, because I'll just say one last thing, which is that, my training as a scientist or a physician says you're not supposed to talk about Republicans and Democrats and liberals or conservatives or red states and blue states. So it's very uncomfortable for me to do it, but I feel like it's important to save lives. And so, I just haven't found a way, Sam, to talk about it other than to talk about it. So I talk about it, or I write about it, even though it's a scary place for me at times.
Well, and I think, it's, it's just not your arena. It's not the arena of scientists, and it is, there's a sort of like in many respects, a market disadvantage. I find this also within the context of the education sphere too, because you're going up against forces that have a slogan, and you're talking about stuff that is nuanced and much harder to communicate. But we will
all of a sudden, I've got Steve Bannon publicly calling me a criminal on his Truth Social website and this kind of stuff. It's so bizarre.
I should say, full disclosure, I think the audience, most of the audience knows this, but I used to work with RFK Jr. On the radio, and there was a couple occasions in the past, this was, closer to 10 years ago now, where we would have a conversation about vaccines. And I started doing this show about 20 years ago. And at that time, was still in the wake of that Lancet article that ended up getting pulled about the correlation, at least, between vaccinations and autism. And there was a theory around in like the early aughts that maybe it was thimerosal.
That's right.
Thimerosal. So walk us through that, because
in
2004, I remember doing an interview about it, and the person saying like, we've got a year or two more to see if the removal of thimerosal is going to have any type of implications, and it ultimately didn't. But walk us through that first era.
Oh, you're absolutely right. So it became kind of this kind of pyrrhic game of whack-a-mole or moving the goalposts. So every time anti-vaccine groups would make an assertion, the scientific community would spend a lot of funding and support to refute, to show it wasn't the case, and find evidence that it wasn't the case, and then they come up with something else. So the original assertion, you're absolutely right, in the late 1990s, a paper was published in The Lancet, a prestigious British medical journal, by Andrew Wakefield and his colleagues, claiming that it was the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the MMR vaccine, the live virus replicated in the gut, and somehow that led to, at that time, it was called pervasive developmental disorder or autism. And the scientific community responded. First of all, the study was shown not to be true. Second, the scientific community responded with big cohort studies showing the kids who got the MMR vaccine were no more likely to acquire autism than kids who didn't, at some fair amount of expense. Then Robert F. Kennedy Jr. came along in 2005, and you're absolutely right. He wrote an article in that very important biomedical journal, the Rolling Stone, saying that it was the thimerosal preservative, also published in Salon. And again, the scientific community did large cohort studies, even non-human primate study, showing that thimerosal was not doing that. And then, so that article was retracted by either Salon or Rolling Stone. I can't remember which, but then it was the other magazine followed along. And then it was Jenny McCarthy and Jim Carrey came along and said, we're spacing vaccines too close together. We have to green our vaccines or some nonsense like that. And then it was alum vaccines. And then it was HPV vaccine for cervical cancer, another cancer. They claimed it was causing infertility or autoimmunity. And then Robert F. Kennedy Jr. came back again and said it was causing something called chronic illness. And it became this really exhausting exercise. But we did it. I mean, the scientific community did it, and the data is sound. But the other part of the narrative is we know now what autism is and how it begins in early fetal brain development through the action of autism genes. A lot of them are neuronal cytoskeleton genes involved in neuronal connections. We actually did whole exome genomic sequencing on my daughter Rachel with my wife Ann and I, and found Rachel's autism genes. And there's a fantastic paper that came out of Stanford Medical School last year showing, using brain organoids with neurons that have those autism genes, how they're migrating differently. So it's a very complete story. It still hasn't gone away. I mean, that thread is still around, and you see
the autism
people,
thread.
still the people resurrected. But I think we've taken a lot of wind out of that sail. The problem is the anti-vaccine groups needed to reinvent themselves, and the way they did it was by enmeshing themselves in Republican Party politics. And I think for the anti-vaccine groups, it was a way to get new relevance and funding. And I think for the extremist end of the GOP, it was a way to get a ready-made group of adherents, to buy into all the other stuff. So I think it was mutually reinforcing for them. And that's when it became a political movement. And that's when it became so dangerous during COVID, because it spilled over into COVID-19 vaccines, which is the subject of the book.
And I just want to touch on this too, in terms of this development, because I distinctly remember too, the HPV vaccine, the biggest concern I heard, which was this is going to make children more promiscuous. I mean, that was deployed by the right at that time, in whatever it was, like 2005 or 6, I think, when this was just being developed, that by giving, a 12-year-old or 13-year-old girl this shot, it wasn't so much that there was a fear of the vaccine as the vaccine functioning as a license to go have sex.
It was both. It was all of those things, and it was so unfortunate because now in Australia they actually have a plan, Sam, to eliminate cervical cancer by the year 2030 or 2035. They're going to wipe out cervical cancer in the nation of Australia, the continent of Australia. We're going in the wrong direction. We're actually unnecessarily condemning a whole generation of girls and women to cervical cancer. I mean, it's so tragic.
So, all right. So you describe it as a marriage of convenience. Is there also an ideological value to the right. I mean, the Republican Party picks up on these things, obviously, from an opportunistic standpoint, but the attacks on science have been embedded in the conservative movement, going back to Gertrude Himmelfarb, in the idea of like, if we can, it's two-part. If we can, say there is no, science is problematic in the sense that there's a certain objective reality to it. And if we can sort of disabuse of that, then we can make everything based upon a values, moral judgment, and we are better off fighting on that terrain. And then two, particularly when it comes to vaccines, we are talking about public health. And the idea of public health is each one of us owes a responsibility to the person next to us on some level, because we're all part of a society. And that is the sort of like, and then that also, you can see it reflected in the policy decisions that need to be made from a strong sort of like a state when it comes to issues of public health.
Yeah, I think it's so. You touched on about 5 or 6 points there, all interconnected, and it takes a little bit to unpack and unravel. So you're right. I think part of it is part of the larger context is an attack on the so-called elites or the intelligentsia, and scientists are part of that. They're intellectuals, and so there's that piece of it. I think, going along with public health, that requires, that's right, cooperation between people and butt up against these concept of health freedom, medical freedom. I think that had a big piece to it. And so what happened was it got adopted as part of the canon, along with, the 2020 election was stolen and Putin over Ukraine. And somehow this became then part of it. But the difference was, by adopting this, it became a killing force, because in the book I point out that 200,000 Americans, 200,000, including 40,000 people in my state of Texas, needlessly perished because they refused a COVID vaccine during the Delta and BA1 Omicron waves in 2021, 2022, after safe and effective vaccines became widely available. And I benchmark it at the start of this. It's actually a kind of a post-Trump phenomenon. I benchmark it at the start of the CPAC conference of conservatives in Dallas in 2021, very much that health freedom rhetoric. First, they're going to vaccinate you, then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles, and as that quote unquote is, and as ridiculous as that sounds to us, people accepted it. So what they did was, in their zeal to push up against vaccine mandates, they went the next step and actively sought to discredit the effectiveness and safety of vaccines. So the Associated Press report on that conference at the time was called "They Clapped at Death at COVID." They're actually clapping for people not getting vaccinated. And then you saw the pile-on. It was the members of the House Freedom Caucus, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and calling people like me medical brown shirts, starting comparing vaccines to the Holocaust, which was so incredibly offensive, or Jim Jordan of Ohio, or Senator Rand Paul started doing this. Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin held these vaccine injury roundtables. And then, very important, it was amplified every night on Fox News. And this was documented by two groups, by Media Matters for America, and also a research group out of the Federal University of Science and Technology in Zurich, Switzerland, documented every night. Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity filled their nighttime broadcasts in 2021 as the Delta wave was accelerating with anti-vaccine content. So, people went down that rabbit hole, and as a sign of allegiance to it, didn't get vaccinated, and they paid for it with their lives on an unprecedented scale. And that's why I'm so passionate about talking about this, because now I feel it's, for me, I developed low-cost vaccines. We made a COVID vaccine for India and Indonesia, reached 100 million people. We have a new human hookworm vaccine. But now, being a vaccine scientist, now making vaccines is the first part. The second part is trying to counter all this anti-vaccine activism, because that is also now a killing force in the United States.
Well, we probably played I don't know how many of those clips of folks on Fox and also online. The more online, the Rogans and the
But
and the
the
other
point is,
right wingers.
that's right. But the point is, it's a whole ecosystem. we too often
Totally.
we call it this, misinformation or infodemic, like it's just some random junk out there. But it's not that. It's, as you point out, it's an organized, well-financed, and predatory movement that killed people.
And very and entrepreneurial. I mean, that's it is. There are I can name you 3 or 4 YouTubers right off the top of the bat where I can show you just with a graph as to when they started to sort of like carry this anti-vax mantle and how it helped their numbers in many respects. But when you cite 40,000 in Texas, 200,000, will you just explain to people the methodology in which you come up with that number, just so that we can address these type of things? I mean, I think for many people it's obvious, but will you just
and it's actually not only my estimates, because a group at the Chan Harvard School of Public Health has come up with this. They're all between 200 and 300,000 numbers. So my 200,000 number may be a little on the conservative side. So Harvard Chan came up with a similar number. Kaiser Family Foundation did. Charles Gaba, the health analyst for ACA signups, came up with 180,000 to 230,000. But they all kind of come around 200,000 plus. It's based on the continued rise of vaccinations after vaccines became widely available in March and April of 2021, and the fact that 85% of the deaths, 85% of the deaths were among unvaccinated individuals, people who weren't getting vaccinated, number one. And so that's the number. But the other really important part is overwhelmingly those deaths among the unvaccinated were occurring in red states, red being Republican, blue being Democrat, and the numbers from Charles Gaba and confirmed by New York Times and Axios and National Public Radio show that the redder the county, the higher the percentage of Republican voters, the lower the immunization rate and higher the death rate. So much so that David Leonhardt of the New York Times just called it red COVID, because that was the reality. And you could see it firsthand. I mean, if I go into more conservative areas of Texas, like in East Texas or Central Texas, essentially everyone you talk to has lost a loved one because they've refused a COVID vaccine. That's where you really start to hear it and see it.
What are the responses? Like, I know, I spent some time, in upstate New York, a fairly rural area, and I know a couple of families who basically the same thing. They're Fox News viewers. They were determined not to get the vaccine, and they lost a member of the family. And in that instance, in my experience, people were, for the most part, like, they went out and they got vaccinated, and some of them were almost evangelical about it afterwards. Same time, I also know some folks up there who are vehemently anti-vax.
Yeah, it varied. I mean, you had people on their deathbeds in the ICU, saying COVID was a hoax as their last dying words. I mean, so they weren't even dying with dignity, all the way to people who say, okay, now I'm ready to get vaccinated, doc, but that's not how vaccines work. You can't wait till you're in the ICU dying of COVID. It's preventative, not therapeutic. All the way to those, who say, don't do what I did, go out and get vaccinated. But the responses were quite variable, but all tragic in their own way. And that's one of the things that I say is, these were victims. These are, amazing people, good people. One of the things that I gave medical grand rounds at Stanford not long ago. And after I'd given medical grand rounds at University of Texas, Tyler, which is a new medical school in East Texas, very conservative. And I said, quite honestly, if my car had broken down because of a flat tire, and you gave me the choice for that car to break down in Palo Alto, California, where Stanford is, or Tyler, Texas, I'd pick Tyler every time, because people would be fighting over who's going to help you change your tire. Right. And so these were extraordinary people who were targeted by the Fox News anchors, the Murdoch family, targeted by members of the House Freedom Caucus, 2 U.S. senators. And it's terrible. And there doesn't seem to be any accountability for it. That's the other. I mean, there's no autocorrection here. It's not, usually in the past, if parents, because I'm also trained as a pediatrician, and in the past, if parents weren't vaccinating their kids and enough parents weren't vaccinating, there was a breakthrough infection like measles. Word would get around the kids were being hospitalized for measles, sometimes in the ICU, and that would be a self-correcting mechanism. Parents would go out and get vaccinated. I'm not seeing that now. I'm seeing this kind of doubling down, and you saw what the Florida Surgeon General has done now with measles, not telling people to get vaccinated. And what you're seeing actually is this revisionist history coming out now out of the members of Congress. They're trying to say, no, it was the COVID vaccines that killed Americans, not the COVID virus, which is ridiculous, or that the scientists invented the virus. And this is playing out now in the GOP-led House hearings, the COVID subcommittee. They're, they literally say on their Twitter site, it says, we're going to sell popcorn, quote unquote, not even pretending this is anything other than political theater, and parading prominent American scientists in front of C-SPAN cameras to humiliate them. It's just awful.
And all right, I want to address some of that, of sort of like some of those belief systems.